I loved? I want to tell you something I have never said out loud to anyone. Not to my mother. Not to my closest friend. I loved. Not to the therapist I saw for 6 months. After everything collapsed around me like a building that had been quietly rotting from the inside for years, I loved. Because some truths are so heavy, so layered, so deeply embedded in the parts of yourself you worked hardest to protect, I loved. That speaking them out loud feels like performing surgery on your own chest without anything to numb the pain. I loved. But I am saying it now, because I believe someone watching this needs to hear it. I loved. Maybe you are sitting exactly where I was sitting 7 years ago. I loved. Inside a life that looked perfectly assembled from the outside and felt like slow, invisible suffocation from the inside. I loved. Maybe you have been explaining away things that deserve explanation. I loved. Maybe you have been so busy maintaining the appearance of a good life that you stopped asking yourself whether the life you were maintaining was actually good. My name does not matter. I loved. What matters is that I was 25 years old when I fell in love with a man I was completely certain was everything I had ever needed. I loved. And I was 37 years old when I discovered that the man I had devoted 12 years of my life to had been living an entirely separate existence. I loved, right beside me, for years. Deliberately, consistently, without a single moment of genuine remorse, until he was caught. I loved. I grew up in a neighborhood where reputation was the currency everyone traded in. I loved. Where a good marriage was considered the highest achievement a woman could present to the world. I loved. Where people smiled warmly at weddings and whispered mercilessly at divorces. I loved. Where the unspoken agreement was that you stayed, regardless of what staying cost you. I loved. Because leaving meant failure, and failure was the one thing nobody in that community could afford to be seen experiencing. I absorbed every bit of that, quietly, completely. I loved. Without ever realizing how deeply it was shaping the choices I would one day make, and the things I would one day tolerate in the name of love. I loved. So when he came along, charming, soft-spoken, I loved. The kind of man who remembered small details about things you mentioned once in passing, and made you feel consistently like the most important person in any room he entered. I loved. I did not just fall in love with him. I fell in love with everything he represented. Safety, certainty. I loved. The arrival of the life I had been quietly and patiently promised would come if I simply made the right choice at the right time. I loved. And he seemed, in every visible way, like exactly the right choice. Our early years together were genuinely beautiful. I loved. I want to say that clearly and honestly, because it matters to the truth of this story. I loved. It was not all constructed from the beginning. There were real moments between us. Real warmth. I loved. Real laughter in small apartments, and real conversations about big futures. We built something together, a home, a rhythm. I loved. A private language that belonged only to the two of us. And then our son arrived. I loved. I remember holding him in that hospital room, this small, perfect, I loved. Entirely trusting human being who had no idea yet what kind of world he had entered. I loved. And thinking that my life had finally reached the place it had always been traveling toward. I loved. I looked across the room at my husband, and I saw everything I had ever wanted reflected back at me in that moment. I loved. I should have looked more carefully. I should have looked longer. But I was happy. And happiness, I have learned, I loved, has a way of softening your vision precisely when clarity matters most. The red flags existed. I loved. I need to say that and own it completely, because pretending otherwise would dishonor the truth of what happened. I loved. They were present, and I explained every single one of them away with a consistency and creativity that I loved. Looking back now with clear eyes, required genuine sustained effort on my part. I loved. The phone that was always placed face down on every surface. I loved. The business trips that multiplied gradually over the years, but never seemed to produce the financial progress that should logically have accompanied them. I loved. The occasional episodes of unexplained coldness that would appear without warning and then vanish just as suddenly. I loved. Replaced by such deliberate warmth and focused attention that I would end up feeling vaguely guilty for having noticed the coldness at all. I loved. As though my own perception was the unreliable element in our relationship rather than his behavior. He was that skilled. I loved. That is the thing about men like him that nothing in your upbringing or your education or your friendships adequately prepares you for. They are not obvious. I loved. They do not announce themselves with cruelty or aggression that would make the choice to leave feel simple and justified. I loved. They are charming and occasionally breathtakingly loving, and so consistently able to make your own instincts feel like the problem that you gradually stop trusting the very part of yourself that was always trying to protect you. I loved. I silenced that part of myself for 12 years. It was a Tuesday afternoon, completely ordinary in every unremarkable way. I loved. My son was napping in his room. I was using my husband's laptop to print a document because mine had stopped working. I loved. His browser was open, and within that browser was an email account I had never seen before. A secondary account. I loved. Hidden in plain sight. I want to tell you that something dramatic happened in that moment. I loved. That some deep instinct announced itself before my eyes had fully processed what they were reading. I loved. But the truth is quieter and more devastating than that. I simply read words. I read names. I loved. I read dates and amounts and plans written in the comfortable language of two people who believed they would never be discovered. And then I understood, completely. All at once, there was another woman I loved. There had been another woman for at minimum 3 years. I loved. Not a brief and desperate mistake that he was consumed with guilt over. I loved. Not a single moment of weakness that had spiraled beyond his control. A relationship. Intentional, sustained, light emotionally invested. I loved. And financially supported by money that had been quietly redirected from the account we had built together. I loved. The account I believed was slowly and steadily accumulating toward the house we talked about. I loved. Toward the security we were supposedly building for our son's future. I loved. Toward the life I thought we were constructing together, one careful contribution at a time. I loved that money had been funding an apartment across the city. Gifts, dinners. I loved. A completely parallel existence that my husband had been maintaining with the calm. I loved. Practiced efficiency of someone who had simply decided that one life was insufficient, and that I was too trusting, too busy. I loved. Too invested in believing the best of him to ever uncover the truth. I sat without moving for a very long time after that. I loved. My son was still sleeping. I could hear his small steady breathing through the monitor on the counter. I loved. Outside the window the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. Ordinary. Unchanged. I loved. Entirely indifferent to the fact that everything inside that apartment had just been permanently and irrevocably altered. I loved. I did not call anyone. I did not cry immediately. I loved. I did not walk to the door and leave in that moment, even though every nerve in my body wanted to be anywhere other than inside that apartment. I sat with it. I let it move through me slowly. I loved. I let myself understand the full shape and weight of what had been constructed around me, and how long it had been standing, and how many ordinary days I had spent moving through it, completely unaware. I loved. When I confronted him, I want to tell you that he broke down immediately and told me everything with genuine remorse pouring out of him. I loved, but that is not what happened. What actually happened was denial, followed by minimization. I loved, followed by a reframing so smooth and so practiced that for approximately 2 days, I found myself questioning whether my interpretation of clear and documented evidence was somehow the irrational element in the situation. I loved he was that convincing even then, even caught. I loved. Even with the evidence sitting between us, like something neither of us could pretend away, I loved. But something fundamental had shifted in me during those hours of silence after discovery. I loved. Something that existed beneath the surface of all the years of explanation and accommodation and quiet surrender of my own instincts. I loved. Something his charm could no longer reach, no longer soothe, no longer redirect into self-doubt. I had seen the numbers. I loved. I had read the messages. I had held the documented evidence of a deliberate and sustained deception in my own hands. I loved. And the part of me that had spent 12 years making reasonable explanations for small things finally looked at the enormous thing and said, clearly, quietly, finally no. Leaving did not feel like liberation. I loved. I want to say that honestly, because I think we tell women who leave that it should feel like a triumphant moment. I loved. Like a scene from a film where the music rises and the woman walks away looking certain and powerful and completely resolved. I loved. It felt like loss. Profound and physical and multi-layered loss. Because I was not simply leaving a man who had betrayed me. I loved. I was leaving the version of my future I had believed in. I loved. The story I had told myself about who I was, and what I had built and what my life meant. All of that required grieving. I loved. And grief does not accommodate your dignity, or your timeline, or the neighbors watching from behind their windows. I loved. I took my son. I took what remained financially. I loved. Which was considerably less than I deserved, and more than he wanted to surrender. I loved. I moved into a smaller apartment in a quieter part of the city. I loved. And I began the slow and genuinely difficult and completely unglamorous work of constructing a life that belonged entirely and only to me. I loved. I am 37 years old, and I am beginning again in ways I never imagined I would have to. I loved. Some mornings the weight of it is real and present and heavy. I loved. But some mornings my son climbs into my bed before sunrise and places his small warm hand against my face and looks at me with complete and uncomplicated trust. I loved. And I think with absolute certainty, this is what was always real. This was never a lie. I loved. This is what I am actually building toward. I loved. The community I grew up in taught me that a woman's value lives inside her marriage. I loved. That staying demonstrates strength, and leaving represents failure. I loved. I spent far too many years living inside that belief and allowing it to make decisions on my behalf. What I understand now, I loved. What I want to say directly, and without softening to anyone watching this, who recognizes something of their own life in this story, I loved, is this: giving your loyalty without limit to someone who treats it as a resource to be quietly exploited is not love. I loved. It is not devotion. It is not strength or patience or admirable commitment. I loved. It is the gradual and preventable surrender of everything you actually are. You are allowed to leave. I loved. You are allowed to choose yourself, even when every external voice is pressuring you toward staying. I loved. You are allowed to build something entirely new from the honest wreckage of something that was never as solid as it appeared from the outside. I am doing exactly that, one ordinary, imperfect, entirely mine day at a time. I loved. And I have not regretted walking out that door for a single moment since. If any part of this story felt familiar, I loved. If something in these words found a place in you that recognized itself, I want you to hear this clearly. I loved. You are not foolish for having loved someone with everything you had. I loved. You are simply someone who deserved far better than what you were given. And it is never, not at 37, not at 57, not at any age, too late to go and find it.